Why do you confess to a priest rather than to God? So when we talk about confession, ultimately we're talking about a sacrament. Now, sacraments are actions of God made present here and now, that they're efficacious signs of immaterial grace, to use the definition of the Catechism. And so when we encounter a sacrament, ultimately we are encountering God's action here and now. And so, for example, the water of baptism. The water brings about a spiritual cleansing. So this is the action of God working through the ministrations of the water. When we talk about confession, we are talking about the action of God that is made present through the ministration of the priest. But then you might ask the question, well, why can't God act outside of that? Well, as the Catechism also says, God is not bound by the sacraments. However, Christ did establish this as the ordinary means to receive forgiveness of sins. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 23, he says to the apostles, whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained them. He gave this ministry of reconciliation, as St. Paul would later call it, this ministry of forgiveness to the apostles. And as the church has held for the past 2,000 years, those apostles gave that to their successors, who gave that to their successors, all the way down through the ages, through apostolic succession, to the priests in the church today. That this ministry of reconciliation wasn't just a one-time thing, but has continued throughout the millennia of the church. And we can see this throughout the history of Christians, that there's always been confession. There's always been this sacrament of confession. In fact, push it further, St. Basil would actually have public penances that would last 7 years. The first 4 years, you weren't even allowed in the church. You had to stay outside the church and ask people to pray for you because you weren't allowed in. So you had to ask people to go into the church and pray for you. The church has always had confession. Now, the question almost always comes up after this. Well, can I ask God for forgiveness directly? And the church does say you can. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, 1452, we read, quote, "When it arises from a love by which God is loved above all else, contrition is called perfect, contrition of charity. Such contrition remits venial sins. It also obtains forgiveness of mortal sins if it includes the firm resolution to have recourse to sacramental confession as soon as possible." In other words, yes, you can, in your private prayers, approach God and say with a true, sincere contrition, I am sorry for what I have done. And that can bring forgiveness of sins, even mortal sins, so long as there's also the intention of using the ordinary means by which Christ has established the forgiveness of sins. And so, yes, there is the possibility of it. But if Christ has established this as the way Christians return back to God, and we choose to reject that, ultimately what we are doing is rejecting Christ himself. We're rejecting what he has given to us. And it's though as a child comes, receives a Christmas present and says to their parent, oh, this is great. Do you happen to have the receipt so I can return it? Like, no, we can't have such ingratitude in the face of such great gifts that Christ has given to us. And so I again, if it has been a little while since your last confession, I would urge you to make use of this great sacrament of the church, make this great sacrament that Christ has given to us to reestablishing the connection between us and him.